Hi class, welcome. It is Wednesday and I'm going to be finishing up Infancy today. We were getting a little bit behind because we had a lot of important stuff to discuss earlier this week. I still have no update yet on how the syllabus will change now that finals week is canceled, but I do have a meeting this afternoon to discuss this with other faculty members, so I should have an update soon. So stay posted for that. We will still have a live class on Friday in which we will start out chatting about our virtual children who we should have raised through age 2 by the beginning of class on Friday. So just a friendly reminder about raising your virtual child. Well, this might be a little bit of review for some of you, but I'm going to talk through these lobes of the brain. And then I'm going to share a video in a little bit on this slide. So first, I just want to point out, I get a little excited when we start talking about the brain. The blue area up front is the frontal lobe. This is where a lot of our reasoning and judgment, our personality, complex thinking is housed there in the frontal lobe. It contains the prefrontal cortex near the front, which is the most complex human aspect of our brain. It makes us uniquely human. This is the part of the brain that is fairly new and the last part of our brain to fully mature throughout our development. And then in the back, we have the purple lobe that's highlighted in purple here. That's a occipital lobe, and it largely processes vision for us. Back here, around the middle of our head is the parietal lobe, and this processes a lot of our bodily sensations. So think touch, temperature, let's see what else, touch, temperature, pain, those kinds of things. And then temporal lobe near our ear, the yellow lobe, is going to process a lot of auditory information because it's located close to our ear, and it will help us to comprehend language as well. So one thing for you to keep in mind is that as an infant, babies are especially plastic, or their brains are especially plastic, meaning that their brains are highly changeable and malleable. If they were to have a brain injury or tumor, the other parts of their brain could easily take over the responsibility of the damaged area of their brain. So their brains are much more adaptable, they can overcome damage. However, if they're deprived of environmental stimulation, such as listening to language or touch from a human, then that kind of deprivation can have permanent effects that essentially impact their intelligence for the remainder of their life. So we're going to watch a video now about an example of such environmental deprivation that happened early on in the lives of many Romanian infants. I want to give you a little bit of background here that what happened or what political events led up to this particular situation coming into existence is that during the Soviet rule, there was a dictator by the name of Ceausescu. He was a Catholic and adamantly against birth control. So he outlawed birth control in his country. And this led to several couples having children that they could not afford to raise. So essentially a lot of families that were heavily financially deprived under Soviet rule went ahead and put their babies on the doorstep of the government. The government formed these different orphanages in which the babies had limited to zero contact with humans. And so they weren't being touched or cared for or spoken to. They weren't exposed to a lot of language. And what we're about to watch is the ramifications of such unfortunate human experiment. So I'm going to make sure I share my sound with you.
Breaking the rules on handling money for his campaign.
David Schweikert broke the law, spending campaign money on private planes and personal perks, and lying to investigators. Because with David Schweikert, it's your money, his gain.
Sorry about that.
So in 1989, communism fell, and the world went to Romania to cover the fall of Ceausescu. There were some medias that actually found institutions that were never meant to be discovered by the public or the outside world. It left the world in shock that such conditions even existed.
Those of us who visited these institutions built by the communist regime are unlikely ever to forget them. Hundreds of children not so much cared for as contained.
Well, at the age of 6 months old, I became ill, and my parents took me to a hospital to be treated for my illness. But instead of finding healing at a hospital, I actually ended up being infected with polio. My parents took me to a different hospital in Sighetu Marmația. They never came back. So the state put me in an institution for handicapped children, an orphanage known as Home Hospital for the Irrecoverable Children.
What's in this room, no one could prepare for. Filthy, dark and stinking. There's excrement everywhere. These boys are the most difficult cases. They deserve the best of care. Instead, they get the worst.
From the moment that we could remember for ourselves, that's all we knew. We didn't have compassion. We didn't have feelings or emotions. We just existed to just vegetate, you know. We were just wild animals that needed to be caged up, is what we were considered pretty much. I grew up there up until I was 11 years old.
Romania has precious little that the world wants except its children. These are the children soon to start a new life far from their real parents. Some orphanages have been emptied already.
I was adopted by a family in Southern California in San Diego, Marlis and Daniel Racon. It was difficult pretty quickly, actually. I could not adapt into a family environment. My mind was just so used to living in the institution, I was desperate to go back to Romania. I got angry. I became super bitter. I even wrote letters asking the workers if they would let me stay with them till I was 18 years old. Each and every single one of them said no. I went back to Romania in 2001. I went to meet my birth family to search for answers. We also went back to the institution where I grew up. I tried to understand my mom. I tried to get to know her, but unfortunately, not every parent wants to be a parent. If I had never come to America, I would either be on the streets or absolutely dead. There's so many kids who are just kicked out of this, who are kicked out of the system. Every city I went into Romania, or every county, when you see a grown adult sitting or standing, rocking back and forth, or doing something that only an institutionalized person would do, you can instantly recognize that person grew up in an orphanage. I do miss the institution sometimes, and people don't understand that because they've never experienced it. It's what we're used to. That's where we grew up. It's our home.
All right, so clearly a very disturbing situation and perhaps confusing for someone who spent most of their childhood there in those orphanages. But I do want to draw your attention to some data on children that have been followed longitudinally since they were adopted out of these Romanian orphanages. So if they were adopted before 6 months, we have 2 bars, one green, one blue here. The green one is for Romanian infants who were adopted into Great Britain. And we see if they were adopted before 6 months that they have the possibility of having a normal IQ at or above 100. And then if they were adopted between the ages of 6 to 24 months, their average IQ is well below normal, just around 95, 96 on average for these infants. And then it declines even further if they spent more of their early life in this state of environmental deprivation. So what we can learn from this graph is that there seems to be a sensitive period here that if they were able to get out of this deprived state before 6 months, then they didn't see these ramifications impacting their IQ at age 6, so many years later. But if they were adopted after age 6 months, then they had these very negative effects that stayed with them longitudinally. So this environmental deprivation was quite detrimental to their overall cognitive health. Now we're going to shift a little bit over to gross motor development. So this is the movement of the large muscle groups. Gross motor development includes whole body movements like crawling, which we know occurs around 7 months on average. These gross motor skills tend to develop in a specific sequence, though it is possible for some infants to skip certain steps. It's just not common. So for example, if I back up a moment, an infant is likely to begin crawling and sitting up on their own around the same stage of life, around 7 months. And by around, 8, 9 months, they begin to pull themselves up on furniture nearby and begin cruising around, trying to explore things that they feel might be easier to simply try and, half walk to. Around 11 months and about 3 weeks is when most infants begin walking on their own, balancing and being able to walk on their own like we saw in the baby's documentary. Though certainly we notice many cultural practices that emphasize the role of gross motor skills. For example, in the case of Pony Jiao from Namibia, she was able to not only walk much earlier than the other infants, but walk with a smoother gait and also more sophisticated movements such as balancing that little box on her head and walking around like that. She even was the only one running very smoothly near the end of the video. And this is a demonstration of how motor movements and being able to balance is of high cultural value in Namibia, because it's likely that she's going to have to balance things to carry them in the future, and therefore they emphasize these skills early on. There was one child who was especially swaddled very tightly. You might recall that in the hospital, the baby was in a swaddle very, very tight, and the nurse or the mother tied a string around the swaddle to keep the baby really tight. And this is often used to prevent the child from scratching their face. Also, swaddling helps them sleep better at night because their own movement will wake them up. It's a common practice, even individuals in developed countries use swaddling, but it can be fairly restrictive to infants, which may delay these gross motor movements, these milestones that they reach. So they might be reaching these milestones much later, like we saw in the case of Bayer Jagal in Mongolia. He was one of the infants that was tightly swaddled, and he was the last of the infants to stand up and be able to balance on his own. In fact, we don't even see him really putting one foot in front of the other. So this is just one of the ramifications of that practice, that potentially it could delay some reaching some gross motor development milestones. Now, fine motor movement is much less celebrated, I have to say. When it comes to infants, we're much more likely to take a video of our child first crawling or sitting up or walking around. These are really common videos shared on social media, but no one really pays attention to this fine motor movement that is also very complex to develop. So we see here a picture of a child simply putting her index and thumb fingers together, or his index and thumb fingers together to grasp a Cheerio and hopefully lead that Cheerio towards their mouth, enabling them to independently feed themselves. So these fine motor skills are really precise and they are huge accomplishments. It's just that we don't tend to celebrate them as a culture in the same way we do the gross motor development milestones. Some major accomplishments, of course, include reaching out for things and grasping them, and then perhaps bringing them back to your mouth to either eat or taste to see if it is edible. So this pincer grasp allows them again to feed themselves and be a little bit more independent, less reliant on their biological mother to meet all of their feeding needs. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Piaget's theory of cognitive development. This stage during infancy is contained within his sensory motor stage of development, and one of the major skills that infants develop across the first year of life is a firmer grasp on object permanence. So object permanence, by definition, is to understand that objects do in fact still exist even when they're out of sight, okay? And so what we're gonna see here first is a video of a 4-month-old who has no concept, who has no mastery of object permanence.
In 2017, Hurricane Maria nearly wiped out all coffee farms in Puerto Rico. Together, we're bringing them back, so hundreds of farmers...
Here, action. Would you like it? We're doing human development science experiment. Would you like a cucumber? How good's your memory? The cucumber's here? Where did it go? Where'd the cucumber go? Where'd the cucumber go? Okay, we're just gonna... Hello. It's not a trick question. Where's the cucumber? It's interesting. Did you get distracted? Or did you... That's not... That's not the cucumber. That's disgusting. That coconut was disgusting when I ate it. Where'd the cucumber go? I disappeared. Is it under here? Is it under here? Or is it out of your ear? Huh? Under here. Where'd the cucumber go? Where'd the cucumber go? Okay. Is it under here? Oh, okay, we're gonna focus here, focus. Is it under here, or is it out of your ear? Okay, now we're just gonna put this one with the other one. Okay, where'd the cucumber go? That's the outside of the coconut. Okay. Is it here? Do you want this cucumber? Do you want this cucumber? Okay, oh, here. Is it under here? Where'd the cucumber go? I don't know until they're like 2. No, this is horrifying. Okay, dude.
Okay, so the infant in that case is quite mystified. They know the cucumber exists, but once it disappears underneath the coconut, it is no longer in existence, according to that 4-month-old in that video. Beyond 4 months and to about the stage of 8 months, infants begin to develop an understanding that things will still exist even if they're out of sight. But before that, this can cause a lot of distress for the infant when their parents leave them with a babysitter, for example, because they think that their parent, as they disappear out the front door, no longer is going to exist or return. So obviously creating a lot of anxiety on the part of the infant. Between 8 to 12 months, they're developing deeper awareness, but they still make some errors. So I'm going to talk about a research error that is very well known called the A not B error. We're going to watch a video of that, of an infant making that error. And then we'll watch a little follow-up on that infant that we just previously saw, who realizes that objects exist, but may not be able to search for them in the same way that you or I would. So first we'll take a look at the A not B error.
You ready? There he is. Very good, Jenna. There he is. There he is. There he is. He's got 2 eyes. Boop, 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 boop. Boop, boop, boop. Can I have the monkey? Here we go. Boop, 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 boop. You're holding on tight this time. You're holding on tight this time. There he is. There he is. Where is it? Oh, there he is. There he is.
So what we witnessed there for that infant who was around just beyond 8 months was that the baby knew that when the researcher put the toy underneath a piece of cloth, it still existed, it didn't disappear. So they searched for it under the cloth. But the moment that the researcher changed the location of the toy to be under a different cloth, the baby perseverated and still searched for that toy in the same original location. So there seems to be something fishy going on here. They know the object continues to exist. So why do they search in a different location when they saw the toy being hidden in that second location? Well, the third video we're going to watch, the follow-up on our original infant, might give us some hints about what's going on with that child who's making the A not B error.
Army Rangers are taught to make tough decisions under pressure. That's why I picked up an enemy grenade and threw it away from.
We have discovered, what was the other thing? It was object permanence. This is a follow-up to object permanence where when the object was hidden, hold on, the baby forgot that it existed. Our baby right now is past the point of object permanence. Watch this. You see the avocado? Where is it? Where's the avocado? Okay, so you see he knows now. This is, it's amazing, it's amazing. This is illustrating something different. Okay, I just discovered this myself because I'm a scientist. The baby knows the object is gone, but he doesn't have the full sensation of his body yet to actually know where to go to get it. So watch this. Piece of avocado. You want this? You want this? Get it. Where is it? Where's the avocado?
It's on his forehead.
It's on your forehead. It's on your... Get the avocado.
It's on here, Ethan. It's on here.
Ethan. No, don't. Look, you see? He knows it's somewhere.
Oh my goodness.
This isn't... He knows it's gone. It's not on your head. It's on your forehead.
Here, Ethan.
Hold on. Don't help him. Don't help him.
Ethan, here. Yeah,
Ethan, there's something on your forehead.
It's on your forehead. Here.
Yeah, right here.
Right here. I think he's hungry now. We've had enough science for the day. Hold on. Let's just get out.
He wants
Science. Let's try it. What is this called? Shepherd's pie?
chicken pie.
Chicken pot pie. Let's try it with a little piece of chicken pot pie. Okay, focus on the chicken. Go. Okay, go get the chicken. Where's the chicken?
On your forehead.
Where did the chicken go? Hold on, he has to surely be upset by a piece of chicken. Okay, thank you. No, where's the chicken? We're gonna do it. Yeah, we're gonna do it again with something.
So the father continues to do this experiment with his child, but the baby doesn't have full knowledge of their body and may not be able to connect their motor movement to the location of the object, which we saw in that A not B error. The baby may know that it's somewhere, right, and over to the left, but they're still searching. They're still like stuck on that same circular sequence of events to reach for the right instead of the left. So this is maybe both memory issues that are at play and also motor movement that is not yet caught up with cognition. So there might be a delay there. So speaking of memory, short-term memory improves during the first year of a baby's life. With object permanence tasks, we know that infants can remember more locations of hidden objects as they progress towards the later months of the first year. Long-term memory increases as well, and a common paradigm that has informed us of long-term memory advances in infants is this one with the mobile above the baby. So the baby has a mobile attached to their foot. And if they move their foot, they're shown initially that they can also move the mobile above them, and which is more exciting and interesting for them. They have done this exact paradigm multiple times to see if babies will remember when put in the same situation. Do they recall that all they need to do is move their foot to also move the mobile? And so they've been able to space out an infant from the first exposure of this environment to 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, and we see there seems to be some recognition memory. So if they're in the same situation and they can recognize, it can cue to them a recollection of a memory that their foot would actually trigger or initiate the movement of the mobile above them. So this is recognition memory rather than recall memory. They have to be cued by seeing this mobile in the first place to recall, to remember essentially that they are able to move the mobile. Now I want to draw another distinction between recognition memory and recall memory, because when we do multiple choice exam questions for, in our exams, we engage with recognition memory. We just have to recognize which is the correct answer that matches or addresses the question above. Instead, with those short response questions, we have to engage recall memory that forces us, or that asks us to produce a memory that we have in long-term memory about those terms and actually produce that memory. So it's much more demanding to have recall memory rather than recognition memory. So talking a little bit more about Piaget's sensory motor theory, his theory, I have to tell you, if I hadn't already mentioned it, that Piaget was a Swiss scientist who based all of his theories on his observations of his own 3 children. So certainly there were a lot of critics because it's difficult for observations of your own biological 3 children to generalize to all babies everywhere. So some criticisms have been that he underestimated infants' ability to, let me see, especially regarding object permanence, that object permanence may come earlier than he proposed. That's one common criticism. And then we also have a whole group of researchers within developmental psychology, one of them being René Bayerjean, who subscribed to a core knowledge approach to infants' cognition. And René Bayerjean said, or says at least in her research, that infants actually understand object permanence much, much earlier, within perhaps the first month or first few weeks of life, as evidenced in the violation of expectations method. So we're going to see an example of this in this video I'll show you.
Just down the hall from Carl, René Bayerjean is finding out when that sense of the possible begins to develop.
Here.
Renee's group puts on magic shows for babies, with results that have astonished her colleagues around the world. Each show tests whether babies know some basic physical rule, that objects can't just disappear, for example.
If babies have the knowledge, they will be puzzled or surprised or intrigued by our magical events. And we know when babies are surprised or puzzled, they tend to scrutinize the events, to look and look and look at them. And so what we do in our experiments is compare infants' responses to magical events and non-magical or real events to see whether they look longer at the magical than at the real ones.
As Holly's attention is captured, a hidden observer starts the timer. This time, it's a non-magical, normal event. The 3-month-old is soon bored. She looks away, and the clock is stopped. Now for the impossible or magical event. Holly stares. She really scrutinizes the event. That means she's surprised. Even at 3 months, she knows the world doesn't work this way. Backstage, there's a simple explanation. 2 dolls moved independently. But Holly is riveted and even startled by such an illogical sight. Over many trials, 3-month-olds have been consistently surprised by the disappearing doll trick. They all seem to understand it's not possible. But take a look at the next result. Babies like Felix, who were just 2 weeks older, were not surprised. Renee concluded that their worldview was more sophisticated.
These babies spontaneously came to the conclusion that we were using 2 different objects, 2 minis, to produce the event. And so what we did to test this interpretation was to lower the screen at the start of each event. We say, no, this is not what's going on here.
Okay, he thinks, I see they've got just 1 doll up there. But unknown to Felix, when the arch is raised, the second doll is slipped back in. And once again, these slightly older babies were back to being surprised, which seems to confirm Renee's conclusion that they had figured out the original trick.
So coming back to this point, we saw in that video that the baby looks longer at the unexpected event, and Renee Bayerjean and her colleagues that are part of that core knowledge perspective jumped to the conclusion that they have mastered object permanence already, just based on the infant looking longer at the unexpected event. So she believes that object permanence, it might reflect memory development that early on has already taken place. There may also be cultural limitations as well that would encourage or prolong this capacity from developing. This is just a little reminder that we're talking about Piaget's sensory motor theory. So this very first stage of his cognitive development theory, in which infants and toddlers become more capable at coordinating the activities of the senses with motor activities. So they're essentially using their new motor movements like crawling and sitting and reaching and walking to be able to explore their environment. They're these little scientists, according to Piaget, who are learning about their environment from moving toward it and sensing it, usually by putting items in their mouth. However, you know, beyond Bayer-Jean's research, our first most common form of researching what infants know and don't know is using the habituation paradigm. So habituation, these types of studies examine infant attention and the way that they process information. We're going to see an example of this in the following clip. Just keep in mind that habituation is essentially how when an infant is first introduced to a new object, and with each subsequent presentation of that object, they become less and less intrigued by it or more bored by the object. So what we're going to see here is essentially the pattern of habituation that is common to most infants that are normally developing.
You would probably look at it for. If I showed you something that you had never seen before, you would probably look at it for a few seconds. If I then showed you that same thing again and again, however, you would tend to get a little bored and look at it less. Many people are surprised to learn that even newborn infants exhibit this tendency to habituate to a repeated stimulus presentation. Let's watch a 2-month-old's very first experience of looking at a jar of cayenne pepper. The colors are bright, the bottle is shiny. It clearly holds her gaze for a while. After about 32 seconds, however, she looks away. We can plot that on a graph so you can see how it changes as we repeatedly present this jar. After she looked away, I placed the bottle out of her view for about 15 seconds and then showed it to her again. Here comes the second time that this little girl ever saw a jar of cayenne pepper. She looked at it again, of course, but this time looked away after about 14 seconds. I hid the bottle for 15 seconds and then showed it to her again. Now she only looked for about 6 seconds. You can see the trend emerging here.
So I'm going to stop it there because essentially you're getting the sense that the first time the infant sees the object, the new object, they look at it the longest, and then each subsequent time they see the same object, it takes a shorter amount of time for them to process and understand what that object is. That it almost halves the amount of time that they will look at it. So that process of getting bored of that stimulus is what we call habituation. And dishabituation is when all of a sudden their attention is revived because you show them a new, interesting, different object. So they're gonna, again, look as long at that second object as they did at the first object. So they have this dishabituation, this revival of attention, and they'll look at that second object for just as long as the first time they looked at the initial object. So neonates take several minutes initially to dishabituate. Once an infant is about 4 to 5 months old, it only takes several seconds for them to do this process of looking, dishabituating, attending for a longer period of time to a new stimulus. Infants with short habituation time process information much more quickly. So if they have a steep curve in that graph that we saw before in the video, then they're what we call short lookers. The infant looked at the first object around 30 seconds, then 14 seconds, and then around 6 or 7 seconds the third time, and it would decrease from there. That would be a short looker because they're quickly learning to process that one stimulus. Long lookers, however, do not look for shorter amounts of time with each subsequent trial. And so it seems like they're not becoming more and more efficient with understanding that object. And this is the earliest evidence that something might be going wrong with the cognitive development of that infant. Infants who are long lookers are more likely to be low birth weight at birth. And being a long looker actually is correlated to a lower IQ later in development. This is one of those more robust predictors of later intelligence. So you want to be a short looker. You don't want to be an infant who has a harder time habituating to stimuli. So this brings us to one of the early batteries that was developed to assess infant development. This woman over off to the right, her name is Nancy Bailey, and she produced a contemporary developmental quotient, or a DQ, which is a measure of infant development. And it contains 3 main scales. Cognition is one of them, so the way that infants think or process information. Language is a second one, which is primarily their receptive vocabulary, how many words do they understand in the world around them, and their motor development. So most of this scale is quite limited in its reliability across the scales. If you could be high in the cognitive scale, for example, and have low language or low motor development skills, and vice versa. So there isn't really a high interreliability between these scales. It's not predictive of later IQ, but it can be used as a screening tool to gain a sense of how well this infant is meeting certain milestones cognitively, linguistically, and also with their motor movement. In longitudinal studies, the only connection between this scale and later IQ is that this cognitive subscale contains a measure of habituation for the infant. That is the only item within any of these scales that is correlated positively with higher IQ and achievement. So being a quicker habituator or a short looker would be positively related to higher IQ and greater achievement later in development. And this brings us to the question, can watching TV as an infant enhance your cognitive development? Well, a lot of the baby Einstein videos that this infant is viewing in the chair in this image to the right stem from a research study that showed a very small effect in an adult sample in which listening to Mozart's music while studying led to greater achievement on an exam. Now, this led essentially Disney and toy creators to make all of these educational videos and DVDs known as Baby Einstein, and appealed to parents, convincing them that if they showed these videos to their infants, then they would be smarter as a result of it. Mere exposure. Most studies have not supported the effectiveness of educational CDs or videos because what we do know is that infants experience a video deficit. They don't understand the fast-paced movement of the television, and research generally just does not support that infants can benefit at all or learn anything from television before 18 months. In fact, if anything, the background noise of a television can distract them and discourage them from engaging in exploration of their environment. We only know that around 18 months, a child may begin to learn new words from the TV content that they view, but before that, there is no cognitive gain from viewing any kind of video content. In fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that infants not have any exposure to TV before the age of 2 because it actually can harm the development of their attention span. So some different effective ways of cognitively stimulating your infant would include talking to them, narrating their life. For example, saying, now we're going to the grocery store. We are going to pick out food. First, we have to go over to the produce, and talking to them in a way that they're listening to the words as you do things and present stimuli to them. This can really help grow their receptive vocabulary or the words that they understand. Telling them stories, reading to them, responding when they make noises like babbles and coos, singing to them, and generally being patient with them are really effective ways of stimulating your child's cognition or cognitive development. So overall, the answer to our question is that no, media or television cannot enhance the cognitive development of your infant. Some important milestones that infants reach with language include at around 2 months, they begin cooing and developing gurgling sounds. Most of these sounds around 2 months are very vowel heavy. So they're the ah. They involve a lot of vowels like A, E, I, O, U. By 4 to 6 months, babbling develops, and this is the combination of a vowel and consonant sound. So gaga, ba, ba, laga, laga, bo, go, go, no, no, no. These are the babbling sounds that babies begin to develop, which seems fairly universal across different cultures around the world. By 8 to 10 months, they begin using gestures. They understand that we wave our hand in front of people to say hello and goodbye. They might point to things to engage you and try and have you attend to the same object they're looking at so you can tell them more about that object. By 10 to 12 months, they should have their first word. And it's interesting because the English language is such a noun-heavy language. So nouns, think people, places, and things, that the first word of most English-speaking infants tends to be a person, place, or thing. So mom, dad, ball, dog, these are all examples of common first words that babies develop in the English language. But if their first language is something else, for example, Spanish or Chinese, which are more action heavy or verb heavy languages, then their first words might have to do with movement, like walking, talking, waving, things like this, because those words are really emphasized within those languages. So infant-directed speech is something that has gotten a bad rap for a long time. It used to be called motherese, and then that seemed sexist, so it was called parentese. And then they realized that all adults use this type of speech with infants, not just parents, so it should be called infant-directed speech. This is a common across most cultures. Some other names, like I mentioned, are motherese and parentese, but now in most research is going to talk about it as ID speech. This speech is much higher in pitch, and parents or adults will use very simplified grammar, such as, look at you, you look so cute, look at you in those shoes. Those shoes are so cute. Oh, you know, this is the type of high-pitched simplified speech that emphasizes each word and usually accompanies each word with a gesture or pointing out objects that you're talking about. And it's very exaggerated in tone. You might repeat words or phrases over and over again. And infants seem to prefer this speech. If given the choice to listen to someone who's using infant-directed speech or adult-directed speech, they always seem more interested and they'll listen longer to infant-directed speech. So some cultures They seem to not speak to infants in any special way because they don't realize, for example, that infants can learn a lot from speech that when we talk to them, even if they're not able to produce speech yet themselves. There's no consistent negative effects in these cultures that don't talk directly to their infants, but we do know that infants who are directly spoken to acquire language sooner, understand language much faster. And this specific type of speech, ID speech, scaffolds or supports earlier language learning. So we're going to watch a small video of a researcher talking about her specific research on ID speech, which I think you'll find fascinating.
My name is Marina Kalashnikova, and I'm a researcher at the Marks Institute for Brain Behavior and Development at Western Sydney University. Our research focuses primarily on how children learn their language. Language is one of the most complex cognitive systems that a human being can acquire. And we are the only species in the world that can acquire language, and even machines up to date are not prepared to learn language in the same way as humans do. But our tiny babies who cannot sit straight or who cannot tie their shoes are already masters in that system. My area specifically focuses on how the language that infants hear in the environment influences their early language acquisition. So babies start listening to speech from very, very early on in the development and start intaking information from that. In fact, we know from research that babies are already learning about their language when they're still in the womb. So our auditory system develops when we are in the third trimester of pregnancy. So the fetus is already perceiving speech that is coming from the environment and primarily from their mother's voice. So when they come to the world, the babies already have very advanced knowledge about the language that they're going to speak. And from then on, they continue listening to what is happening around them to learn the different aspects of their language. So those aspects include sounds, the rhythm of their language, how syllables can be constructed, which are the appropriate words of their language, and further on up to how to construct sentences or how to use language in different social situations. Infant-directed speech is a type of speech that we produce unconsciously and spontaneously when we are in front of a baby, and everybody who's ever seen a baby has probably done it. And it is distinguished from adult-directed speech, so we tend to produce speech that is higher in pitch and that has more varied intonation. Others are visual characteristics, so we tend to smile more when we speak to babies, also raise our eyebrows, widen our eyes. And others are more structural. So for example, we exaggerate the sounds that we produce in our speech. We also tend to make our sentences simpler. So it is suggested that it is not just a cute way of speaking to babies, but we actually make our language easier for them to learn and to acquire. Now, another interesting question is why we produce infant-directed speech in the first place and how this special register developed. It is still one of the main questions that we are trying to answer in our research. But one of the indications that we have from previous studies is that infant-directed speech may have an evolutionary antecedent. So for example, in situations where we started foraging, the infant needed to go on the ground near the mother. And of course, as we know, infants start getting distressed as soon as they leave their mother's arms. So we believe that the mothers at that point developed this tendency to produce higher pitch vocalizations that could comfort and soothe their babies and also transmit a non-threatening intention to them while the babies were separating from it. And what is fascinating is that we're not the only species to do that. Birds also produce infant-directed vocalizations and also other primates. So for example, different mammals tend to produce higher pitch vocalizations when they approach their offspring because a higher pitch denotes a smaller vocal tract or smaller shaped animal, so we're less likely to appear threatening to our offspring. So we believe that humans adapted that animal behavior that later developed into this useful tool in which we can soothe our babies, but also facilitate the task of learning language to them. What we do know that infants prefer their mother's voice when it is compared to a different female's voice from their first hours of life. So that also demonstrates that infants are hearing their mother's voice while they're still in the womb.
So I think that's where, I wanted you to see her talk about infant-directed speech and understand that not only does it have an evolutionary beginning, that other animals, other species use infant-directed speech, but that is not something that is used to demean the child, but rather to help them learn language. So if you ever hear someone say, I only ever talk to my infant like an adult, you might respond by saying, did you know if you talk to them using infant-directed speech, they might acquire language much sooner? I know you're probably thinking, gosh, this is a lot longer than class normally is. So definitely take a chance, just a moment to take a break, stand up, stretch, pause, move around, and return back to lecture. There's not much left, but we're getting through the final stretch, which is why I pre-recorded this lecture. So we're going to talk about temperament, specifically the classic theory of temperament proposed by Thomas and Chess. This defined various innate tendencies that an infant may have and that later become essentially the building blocks of their adult personality. So these different innate tendencies are their general activity level, their ability to adapt to new situations, the intensity of their reactions emotionally, and their general quality of mood. And we're going to see an example here in a video of two different infants that have quite different temperaments. They vary a lot on these different aspects of temperament. So let's take a look.
Back at the University of Maryland, infants are brought in at 9 months for the second assessment of the temperament study. This time, researchers want to measure the emotions of anger, joy, and fear, all aspects of temperament. First, Jack is allowed to play with a colorful toy. Then a transparent barrier is put between him and the object of his desire. He sees the toy, but can't reach it. No matter how frustrated Jack feels, he won't give up. And when he can't do it on his own, he tries to charm the researcher into helping him. Emily, also 9 months, is of a different temperament than Jack. It seems she's more laid back. She gives it 1 or 2 tries, but then gives up. And even when the researcher tries to entice her again, she can't be bothered.
My name is Zoe. How do you do?
Everyone knows that a puppet show makes children happy.
Who do we have here today? She's awfully cute.
During this part of the study, researchers want to draw joy from the babies.
What's your name, Emily?
Emily loves the puppets and even tries to join in on the action.
It's nice to see you here today. Are you having fun? Who do we have here today?
But when the researcher tries the same experiment on Jack, he finds the situation anything but joyful.
Zoe, how do you do?
His temperament is such that he's easily frightened, and he will have none of it. The minute the puppets are removed, he cheers up and is ready for more action. Next, researchers test the baby's reaction when something frightens them. Not surprisingly, Jack is shaken by the scary mask. So they bring on the clown mask. And this one really pushes him past his limit.
But Emily is very interested. She finds the clown amusing and thinks it's just a continuation of the previous entertainment. As for the more ominous mask, she just takes it in stride and adopts a wait-and-see attitude. Why does Emily react differently from Jack? Where does the difference reside? To find out, Dr. Peter Marshall places an EEG cap on Emily. The electrodes on the cap will measure the electrical signals produced by her brain in response to a series of sounds. A researcher distracts Emily while they get a baseline reading of her brain. Then she hears a series of tones. The series consists of regular beeps interspersed with other sounds that are different. How the brain reacts to sudden new stimuli is recorded. Emily seems to have more activity in her right frontal lobe. This kind of reading is associated with children who have a more subdued personality. But what has fascinated researchers is that babies with exuberant temperaments show an exaggerated response on the other side of the brain, in the left frontal lobe. In test after test, this groundbreaking research has shed light on the neurobiological basis of restraint and exuberance. Jack overreacts so much that he won't even allow the cap to be put on. One can only guess what the alpha waves in his left frontal lobe are showing. But is emotional temperament constant over time? Will the temperament that Elizabeth exhibits at 6 months be the same when she is older? Will the curious toddler remain curious forever? The lounger, the joker, the dreamer, the industrious one. Are they destined to carry these temperament traits into the years ahead? And what about the worrier? And even the shy one? To find out, researchers at Nathan Fox's lab bring back children previously tested for the final part of the long-term study.
So I'm going to pause there because they go more into toddlerhood, which we might return to in the next chapter. But I want to make sure that we wrap up this chapter first. So we could tell, for example, that, Emily was had a lower activity level than Jack. She adapted more easily than he did. He was much more frightful of new stimuli, and he had more intense reactions than she did. She had a much more subdued personality or temperament. And her overall quality of mood was quite calm, and his was quite reactionary or highly excitable, and what they termed exuberant in the video. What we know from Thomas and Chess's original theory is that they like to classify babies into at least 3 different specific categories. The first one being easy, which they found 40% of the babies were much more adaptable to new experiences. Like Emily, they generally displayed more of a positive mood and probably had also normal eating and sleeping patterns as well. They were very regular in their routines. Alternatively, difficult babies tend to be very emotional, irritable, and fussy, which more so aligns with Jack, who cried a lot with different stimuli. They may have more irregular eating and sleeping patterns as a result of these high or more volatile emotional fluctuations. So slow to warm up infants, kind of one that was pictured near the end of the clip we just saw. These are babies that have a low activity level and they withdraw from new situations and people. So even though Emily had a low activity level, she showed pretty high approach. She was very engaging. She liked to socially interact with the researcher, so she would not be considered slow to warm up. These babies are much more shy. They don't like new experiences, new people, and it might take a very long time for them to adapt to new places or people. I want to step back for a moment because we can recognize here that this only accounts for 65% of infants. That leaves easily, 35% of the infants that are not classified at all. So this was one theory of temperament that has kind of gone to the wayside. They focus less on categorizing infants and more so on looking at their activity level, their adaptability, their intense reactions, and just you know, describing a pattern of different capacities rather than categorizing them in one way or another. Because again, 35% of the infants in Thomas and Chessa's study couldn't be categorized at all. So what is goodness of fit? Well, this is defined as a really good fit between the temperament of the child and the demands of their environment, specifically the parenting style of their parents. Children who have a really good fit with their parents aren't, you know, reprimanded or punished very often because they have really good communication with their parents, and there doesn't seem to be a high level of conflict between them and their parents. That's when they have a really good fit. Babies with negative temperamental qualities, so that difficult baby we talked about on the prior slide, really need parents who are much more patient and tolerant, who are responsive, and aren't going to be harsh and punitive with that child who is more fussy and less, you know, easygoing. So I always like to share a story here about myself and my own mother. I was a difficult parent, or I was a difficult child. I had a very challenging temperament as a baby because I had colic and I cried all the time for no apparent reason. But I did much better around my mom. I kind of preferred to only be around her. And perhaps I could be described as slow to warm up in new situations or not very adaptable. But certainly I fit it more neatly within that difficult baby category. And I think the fact that I didn't grow into a difficult child or adolescent or adult is very much attributed to the fit with my mother, who was much more patient, responsive, calm around me. And so we had a really good fit as a result, because even though I had these negative temperamental qualities, she was very sensitive to them, and she was not easily excitable or harsh and punitive with me. Cultures value very different traits. So for example, in Asian cultures or children who are of Asian descent, it's more preferable for them to be less active than it is in our American culture. So a baby would be preferred if they were more of a chill, relaxed, less active baby, culturally speaking, than in the United States, in which we find like high activity babies to be perhaps entertaining or interesting. So this can very much differ, like what the cultural goodness of fit is for a baby. Like if you were a really active, like to move around a lot type of baby in an Asian culture, you might get reprimanded more or punished more often, and there might not be a good cultural goodness of fit there. So I know I mentioned before that we would talk about infant emotional perceptions, particularly in the situation of a mother being depressed, when we were talking about postpartum depression earlier in a previous chapter. We know that crying in response to hearing another cry is evidence of emotional contagion. So babies, when they hear other babies cry, like Madi did in the babies documentary, she was hearing all those babies cry in her daycare, and this caused her to cry even though she personally wasn't upset for any particular reason. We hear these emotions first, and that is something that will trigger a similar emotion or a mirrored emotion in ourselves. And this is true of infants in particular. So infants perceive emotions first by hearing them, and second by seeing them. And what we notice in this paradigm that I'm about to show you is that infants very quickly learn what to expect in social interactions when it comes to the emotional displays of their parents and their emotional reactions on their facial expressions. So I'm going to show you what can happen when a parent is not responsive or not reactive when their baby's trying to engage with them, and how such depressed affect can affect a child's overall, you know, their development, their emotional development.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm my good girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So the ugly situation that he's referring to in the video is that case when a parent is depressed or
Verizon knows how to build unlimited right. Start with America's most awarded network. Offer the best in entertainment and plans to mix and match starting at $35 with the stunning
Stop the video there. Pardon me. Okay, we're going to get back to just wrapping up this lecture. So as I was saying, you know, he's talking about the bad, the ugly, is when a parent may have postpartum depression or some kind of mental illness that impedes them from interacting in a normal way with their infant, and it can potentially change the track of their emotional development. Because at 7 months, infants can match the sound they're hearing to visual emotions. They know when someone's laughing, you know, what that looks like, or when someone's sad, they know what, you know, based on that sound, what that looks like visually. By 9 to 10 months, infants also show social referencing. So, you know, they look to their parent to understand how they should respond to a situation. If their parent looks scared, for example, because they just fell off a jungle gym, then they suddenly seem very distressed and upset at seeing their parent be upset. If their parent remains calm, then they realize that, oh, it's okay, I'm not in danger, I can remain calm as a you know, as a response to their ability to social reference their parents, to social reference the emotions that their parents are displaying. So ultimately, this is coming back to, can the infant trust their parent to provide for them, for their physical needs, emotional needs, or is their parent not very responsive to them? Are they ignoring them? Do they not give the child food when they need food, or change their diaper when it needs to be changed? According to Erik Erikson, this first stage of development is known as trust versus mistrust, and it spans the first 18 months of life. And it centers around this emotional bond between the infant and the parent. The infant either builds a trust, they know that they can reliably depend on the parent to provide for all their needs, both physical and emotional. So reliable, sensitive care and affection is really key to them building a trusting relationship of their parent. And developing this trust during infancy provides a really strong foundation for their future social and emotional development, because they learn that not only they could trust their parents, but ultimately they could trust another person and build trust in other relationships. Now, one theory we're going to dive into much deeper in toddlerhood is this theory of attachment that was proposed by Bowlby. He was really focused on the quality of relationships early on between the infant and the caregiver. And he thought, like Erikson, this caregiver needs to be very sensitive and responsive in order for there to be a healthy attachment between the infant and the parent. This attachment theory has evolutionary basis, meaning that, it allowed us to survive. This ability to attach to our parent ensured our survival. And in research on mother-offspring relationships in animal species, we see, for example, in the ducks, the ducklings that imprint initially on the first moving item they see. This allows for them to be guided by someone who will care and provide for them. So this is kind of analogous to this attachment, this secure attachment an infant can form with their parent. So with all of that, I know this was a long chapter with a lot of cool videos, but I do hope that you feel free to ask me questions on Friday when we meet together in our live class, or come to my office hours later today between 1:15 and 2:45, or on Friday from 10:45 to 12:15. I'd love to see you there, and I'd be happy to discuss some of these concepts, which are quite complex, and this was a really rich chapter. So I hope you enjoyed it and it wasn't too long and exhausting. I will see you on Friday. Take care.